Well, we are spending Advent this year looking at Jesus in the Old Testament. The Old Testament was completed about 400 years before the birth of Jesus, and it's a group of books that anticipate the coming of Jesus. And so during this season, where we anticipate the day where we celebrate his coming, we're remembering that time of anticipation and reminding ourselves to live in anticipation of his coming again. He was faithful to his promise. He'd made all kinds of promises in the Old Testament through the law and the prophets and the symbols and the pictures that were there. He promised that he would come, and then he came just like he said he would. And so because he was faithful to that promise, we know that he's going to be faithful to his promise to come again. And so we can remember that during this season. We can look to him during this season. And what we hope to see in him today is the reason that he can be trusted to be our source of joy. The ways that he can hopefully break up some of our apathy and the indifference that creeps into our spiritual lives. When we open up the Bible, we believe that we see Jesus there, and seeing Jesus is transformative. And so we hope that as we open it up, we'll see him today. We'll see him as the reason for joy, and our prayer is that this would make us a joyful people. And one of the places that you see Jesus in the Old Testament is in the story of this people, Israel, and their search for a true king. Israel as a nation, they were a unique people. They were the only nation in history that God made a covenant with. God had a unique relationship with Israel. He gave them his laws like the Ten Commandments. He gave them promises that they would be God's people and that he would be their God. And one of the distinctions was that as God's people, they wouldn't need a king like the nations around them because God was their king. And God mediated his rule through his law. They had judges that applied that law. And under God, they were a free people. So they didn't need a king like all the nations around them did. They were very unique in that way. But then they started looking around at the nations around them, and they saw these nations with kings, and those nations seemed to be strong. Those kings made their nations unified and intimidating and dangerous. And then the Israelites looked to some of their leaders, they looked to the judges, and they wanted their judges to fix their problems, but they just kept failing. They wanted their judges to be righteous, and when they weren't meeting those expectations, the people said, okay, just forget this unique nation under God, with God as our king thing. We want kings like everybody else. And this is how that went down. This is 1 Samuel chapter 8, verse 4. It says, then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah and said to him, behold, you are old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations. He said, we're rejecting the way God had made us to be. We want kings. But the thing displeased Samuel when they said, give us a king to judge us. And Samuel prayed to the Lord. And the Lord said to Samuel, obey the voice of the people and all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. According to all the deeds that they have done, from the day that I brought them up out of Egypt, even to this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are also doing to you. Now then, obey their voice, only you shall solemnly warn them and show them the ways of the king who shall reign over them. So Samuel told all the words of the Lord to the people who were asking for a king from him. He said, these will be the ways of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and appoint them to his chariots, and to be his horsemen, and to run before his chariots. And he'll appoint for himself commanders of thousands and commanders of 50s, and some to plow his ground and reap his harvest, and to make his implements of war and the equipment of his chariots. He'll take your daughters to be perfumers and cooks and bakers. He'll take the best of your fields and vineyards and olive orchards, and he'll give them to his servants. He'll take the tenth of your grain and of your vineyards and give it to his officers and his servants. He'll take your male servants and female servants and the best of your young men and your donkeys and put them to his work. He'll take the tenth of your flocks, and you shall be his slaves. In that day you will cry out because of your king whom you've chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. So the people come and they demand a king, and God says, fine, give them what they want, but make sure that they know exactly what they're getting. And Samuel tells them what it's going to be like when they have a king with that much power. You give a person that much power, and it can be very dangerous. Here's what will happen. He says they will oppress you. They'll think that they own your things. They're going to take your orchards like they're their own. They'll think that they own your children. They're going to take your children and treat them like they're theirs. They'll take a tenth of your flock. And this is hard for us to imagine in our day, but in their day, governments could get so oppressive that they would charge a 10% income tax. So it was different world, crazy days. But in seriousness, what's significant about that is that in their days, the king was trying to take the place of God because God demanded a tenth. God told them to give 10% or a tithe of their increase as worship to him. And that's what you give to God as a way of saying, all that I have is yours. But then the king would come in and demand a tithe because he would claim that everything was his. The people would go and they would dedicate their children to God in the temple, and the king would come and claim those children like they're his. And this is just a normal way of things where totalitarian governments throughout the world do the same. They try to take the place of God because gods don't share their people. God claims his people, and kings often try to as well. God squeezes out tyrannical rulers, and tyrannical rulers try to squeeze out God. And this is why in tyrannical countries all over the place, you see the way that they oppose the church, because gods do not share their people. Chesterton said that once abolish the God, and the government becomes the God. So ultimate power will have to rest somewhere, and so Samuel's warning the people, you want a king, he's going to try to take that power. He's going to try to be ultimate. So the people hear this warning, they ignore it, and then they get what they want. They get a king. But God is incredibly gracious. He helps his kids clean up the messes that they make again and again and again. And then in 1 Samuel chapter 12, verse 14, he makes this gracious promise to them. They didn't deserve this, but he says, if you will fear the Lord and serve him and obey his voice and not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, and if both you and the king who reigns over you will follow the Lord your God, it'll be well. But if you will not obey the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then the hand of the Lord will be against you and your king. And so God is like this father who's just always bailing his son out of jail. He told him what to do, he told him not to do that thing, still he did that thing, and still God shows up to bless. And so God says, you shouldn't have asked for a king, but here's the deal, that's not ideal, but if you're faithful and your king is faithful, I'll allow it to go well. There can be a faithful king. And so if that comes along, I'll allow you to thrive even under a king if the people are righteous and the king is righteous. And that began the days of waiting for a true king to come. A king who was strong and powerful, who would lead them well, but who would also be faithful to God and blessed by God. And so then you start to see this history where king after king comes along. Saul becomes king, and it looks good at first. He wins some battles, but then he turns back from the Lord and he descends into madness. Then comes King David, and at first he's showing tremendous character and courage. He slays Goliath. He establishes Jerusalem as their capital. He builds a palace. He defeats enemies. He writes psalms because he's a man after God's own heart, but then he sins, he abuses his power, he takes Bathsheba, and things begin to unravel. So he wasn't the true king. But then David had this son named Solomon. And his name means the man of peace, the shalom man. And this is what happens when Solomon is anointed, because they think they've found the one. 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 38, it says, so Zadok the priest, Nathan the prophet, and Benaiah the son of Jehoiada, and the Cherethites and the Pelethites went down and had Solomon ride on King David's mule and brought him to Gihon. There Zadok the priest took the horn of oil from the tent and anointed Solomon. Then they blew the trumpet, and all the people said, long live King Solomon. And all the people went up after him, playing on pipes and rejoicing with great joy, so that the earth was split by their noise. So finally there's this righteous king. He's so good, and they have so much hope in this king that they throw this rocking party in celebration of the fact that they finally found the one. And there's so much celebration, and there's so much noise that the earth splits. So they're finally past all of the bloodshed and the abuse of David. They're past the madness of Saul. We've got our guy. We've got the shalom man. We've got the one. This is the true king. He'll be faithful, we'll be faithful, and God will bless us. And so their hope is all wrapped up in Solomon. He'll be rich and kind and wise. He'll build a temple where God will be worshiped. And early on, it pans out. He shows himself to be wise in his decisions. He points to the Lord as his righteousness, as his source of wisdom. He teaches his sons how to follow the Lord in wisdom. Most of our book of Proverbs was written by him. And people started coming from around the world to see the wealth and learn of the wisdom of Solomon. The Queen of Sheba came and just stood in awe of him. This is the guy. So they celebrate. The champ is here. He's our one. And Proverbs says in Proverbs 29:2, when the righteous increase or the righteous rule, the people rejoice. But when the wicked rule, the people groan. So the people celebrate at first. It's a huge celebration. They make so much noise that the earth splits. And that's the right way to respond to the right king. You should respond with joy. You should respond with celebration. You should respond with all kinds of hope for the future and peace about your security and relief that now, because someone who's wise is running this place, justice will be done. God's wise ways will be in the driver's seat through this wisest man ever to live. And when that's real, there's just no room for apathy. When the righteous king rises, you can rejoice. You can relax. You can let your hair down, and you can celebrate with abandon. But then you read on, and even Solomon falls. All of his success goes to his head. It brings temptation toward decadence, and he gives in. He falls. He falls in love with money. He falls in love with his own glory. He indulges his lusts. He worships other gods. And so again, this nation is disappointed. And he was their best hope. And this cycle of hope and joy followed by crushing disappointments continues. And it's actually far worse to have hope like that wrapped up in a person and then have it crushed than to never even have hope at all. And this happens enough times to a nation and it will change their psyche. I mean, you would expect people who have these cycles of repeated hope and joy followed by failure and disappointment, you would expect them to become very jaded and guarded. You'd have to be very careful to ever get hopeful again when these kind of things keep happening to you. Your joy would feel like it always had to have a seatbelt on. You'd always have to be cautious. You just can't be that joyful. Because when you see that much failure in the people that you'd hoped in, you're going to guard your heart. You're not going to get too wrapped up in anybody else ever again. Obviously, the easy analogy is Bills fans, like where we'll watch the games. And last week, it's the end of the game, and the Bills were kneeling down to win the game. And my son, who's 13, says, they could still lose. Because he knows, he knows. We learn to protect our hearts. You can't get too into it because you know you'll get crushed again. And sometimes, the Bills season can become like a metaphor for life, where you protect your heart by becoming cynical and sarcastic and just being careful to just kind of be like meh about everything. So everything starts to become an eye roll, everything's suspicious. You hold back on joy because you want to avoid that heartbreak. You always keep joy's seatbelt on. And so we can live our lives where we don't get too into anything so that everything just kind of becomes boring, everything seems dull, because it all just disappoints in the end. So I'm sure the people of Israel were feeling that, but then God keeps speaking. He says things like, you know how no good king is coming from you? You see how you can't find that one true righteous king? Well, here's my promise. Not only will I allow it to go well for you if you do get a good king someday, I'm going to send you that good king. And the government will be upon his shoulder. And his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end. On the throne of David and over his kingdom to establish it and uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. He promises them in Micah 5:2, but you, O Bethlehem Ephrathah, who are too little to be among the clans of Judah, from you shall come forth for me one who is to be ruler in Israel, whose coming forth is from of old, from ancient days. Now, obviously, you see where this sermon is going. This is predictable. Jesus is this true king. Jesus is the king that doesn't disappoint in the end. He's the king that's worth celebrating with so much joy that the earth splits. He isn't a king that fails at the end of his story. He looks like he does, They think he does. They think he's the latest disappointment when he's hanging on the cross and being crucified like a criminal, but then he rises from the dead and defeats death. And he reigns as the perfect king even now, where he's powerful and wise. People from around the world, even today, are drawn to his wisdom. He slays our greatest enemies, and Satan, sin, and death. And true, like any king, he claims to be the sovereign. He doesn't share his people. He does claim to rule over everything. He makes very clear that everything that we have is his. But he's the one good thing, or the one good king, so that everything we give to him, we get back 1,000 times over. And so he said in Luke 6:38, "Give, and it will be given to you. Good measure, pressed down, shaken together, running over, will be put in your lap. For with the measure you use, it will be measured back to you." Mark 10:29, Jesus said, "Truly I say to you, there is no one who has left house or brothers or sister or mother or father or children or lands for my sake and for the gospel, who will not receive 100-fold now in this time, houses and brothers and sisters and mothers and children and lands with persecutions, and in the age to come, eternal life." So he's a king who claims it all, but then gives it back 1,000 times over. And in this process, he gives himself. He gives his life. Oppressive kings will come in and say, "Your life exists for me." This king comes in and gives his life for us. So in Jesus, the champ really is here. And when the righteous increase or rule, the people rejoice. But when the wicked rule, the people groan. And so in Jesus, we should have room for so much joy that when we celebrate, the ground splits. So then the question is, why are we so often so apathetic? I mean, if that's the right response to the true king, that when the true king comes, you party, you celebrate, you can have joy with abandon, joy without a seatbelt, then what's the reason for our apathy and our lack of joy? Like still, even now. We also suffer a little bit from acedia, which is not a word we use a whole lot, but Dorothy Sayers defines it as the sin which believes in nothing, cares for nothing, seeks to know nothing, interferes with nothing, enjoys nothing, loves nothing, hates nothing, finds purpose in nothing, lives for nothing, and only remains alive because there is nothing it would die for. And that sounds like us pretty often. So why is that if the righteous king reigns? I mean, it makes sense that we'd be disillusioned about other kings, about other leaders, about other hopes. It makes sense that we're jaded about an awful lot because we're all sold stuff all the time that doesn't work and doesn't pan out. But if Jesus really is this king, why the apathy? Why are we so often spiritually indifferent and asleep and cold? And what can we do about it? In his excellent book, Overcoming Apathy, Uche Anazor lays out some of the reasons for our apathy and some of what we can do about it. It's a book I would highly recommend, but one of the big reasons for our apathy is doubt, that we don't believe that all this is true. Because to believe the Christian story is to believe in the most thrilling of stories. And in Jesus, we really do find the greatest of joys. Part of the reason for our apathy is we don't really believe that these things happened. We don't really believe that Jesus came. We don't really believe that he died and that he rose, and that all this theology that we have concepts of really is true and active and strong and begging to be applied and put into practice. I mean, for us, sometimes the Christmas message can just become sentiment. It's just sort of the story that's in the background. It's the background music at Target while we shop and get about, like the real mission of Christmas. It's just sort of a childhood fantasy that's not real. It's almost like we don't believe, and you know that because we're not thrilled. Because the Christian story is the most thrilling of stories. This is the biggest deal. Sayers again says, now we may call that doctrine exhilarating or we may call it devastating. We may call it revelation or we may call it rubbish. But if we call it dull, then words have no meaning at all. The Christian message is anything but dull. And so sometimes because we doubt it or we don't believe it, we don't get joy from it. Sometimes another source of our apathy is just grief over all of our disappointments and losses. And that keeps us from wanting to go all in. That keeps us from wanting to have zeal again. We've been there. I mean, some of us have been so disappointed in church that we don't want to work up the joy anymore. And I think sometimes as churches, we can create this problem. We tend to represent ourselves as more than we are. Where we're supposed to be an imperfect gathering, an imperfect community that point people to Jesus, we sometimes can step in and point people to ourselves and our programs and our leaders as the solution. We almost represent like that this is the true one. This is the true king. This is the true community. This is ultimate. And you see the stories about how some pastors start to believe that. They start to believe that I'm the answer. And then you read story after story about how they oppress and they only take from their people, acting like they are the true king. But ultimately, all of our leaders will disappoint. Sometimes just through normal human weakness, sometimes through real corruption. And we had hoped in them. We thought like, this is the one, this is the real one. And again, we're disappointed. So our hopes and our vision for the church don't pan out, and the joy in what could be gives way to the reality of what is, so we protect our hearts. Then we hear, well, we're supposed to be rejoicing in Christ, and we say, yeah, but I tried that. The question is, did we try that, or were we rejoicing in the wrong thing? Like, did we try rejoicing in his gifts, which are mostly temporary, but good, and to be received with thanksgiving? A good church should be received with thanksgiving. The good gifts of Jesus, the answers to prayer, should all be received with thanksgiving, and we should have real joy in those things. But the joy of our heart should be wrapped up in him and not in the things that he gives. All of his gifts are good, but they're also limited, and some of them go away. So did we wrap our hearts up in a church or in a leader or in an idea and not in the true king? Because the true king doesn't disappoint. So sometimes we just start to get apathetic about the whole thought. Another one of Anna Zor's reasons for our apathy is just the triviality of our day. And the way that he talks about like the evening news where they can describe a tragedy and then say, and now this, and switch to describe the lightest story you could ever imagine. And you almost have to like contain all of those emotions all at the same time when you watch that. And I think social media makes it worse, where we can scroll through a news feed and see big things mixed with absolutely trivial things. So we can scroll through and see there's a war in Europe and Putin is threatening to use nukes. And then here's a prank that some people played on their friends on the ice. And then here's a device that'll help you cut onions. And here's my friend who says Jesus is the reason for the season. And so we're mixing all these things, like these really big things with these really small and trivial things. And we get really used to hearing really big news next to trivial news and just numbing ourselves to everything. And so numbness to Jesus can kind of fit that pattern as well. This can cause us to kind of miss the message of the cross because it doesn't seem like a big deal to us. It becomes very commonplace. It's in the same social media drawer as the onion chopping tool, so it's not that big of a deal. But there are a couple big reasons that none of the kings panned out in the Old Testament, and both of those problems are fixed by Jesus. And one of those problems is that those kings themselves were sinful like us. So just like sin grows in us, it grew in them, and they were unrestrained, they had power, and they did all kinds of damage with it. So it wasn't like there was a righteous person you could find to put on that ballot. Like they didn't have a good candidate for king, not a perfectly righteous person. So there wasn't someone who didn't have sin in their heart. There wasn't someone that didn't have that selfishness and that wickedness. But then Jesus came, who didn't have sin. He is the one true king, all the way down to the bottom. With no sin, with no failure in him at all. Another reason all those kings didn't pan out is they attempted to impose God's good laws from the outside, but they couldn't change the heart. And if you had God's good laws and even a relatively good king, but people who didn't want to follow God's ways from the heart, it wouldn't work. But the gospel is a big deal because it solves both of those problems. You have the sinless, perfect king, and you have this message that has the power to change hearts. He's a king who rules not just from outside of us, but also from within us as he softens hearts and changes hearts and gives us new hearts. And the way that rule can enter into our lives is when we first recognize our need. When we say, I know that I've sinned, I know I need a savior, I know I need to be rescued, I've brought God's judgment on myself, I deserve hell, I can't fix any of this. So we cry out to God for the one true king. And he sent him, and we trust him. We recognize our failure, and then we trust in Christ. We trust that he's the one true king who came to conquer our greatest enemy, which wasn't political. It wasn't a problem out there, but our greatest enemy was the problem in here, our sin and our enmity with God. From there, we believe that he died to take our place and he rose. And if we'll turn and believe, we'll turn from our sin, turn from what was driving us, turn from our selfishness, and believe in what he did for us on that cross, we'll be forgiven. And then from that point, of really receiving forgiveness and grace and mercy, we live changed lives. We can be really apathetic about Christ because we think he came to bring just one more religion, just one more moral code. But he came to rescue. And he came to bring about a rescue that's so profound that it changes us. He came to live out the reality that he is the one true king that we long for, the one that we can really hope in, the one that we can really rejoice in with joy without a seatbelt, without holding anything back, because he's real and he's true. There's a scene on the cross in the last moments of Jesus. He's hanging there, he's dying. This is Matthew 27, verse 50. It says, "And Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split." Just like the earth split when they celebrated Solomon's reign, Jesus comes and he's reigning. He doesn't look like he's reigning. He's hanging on a cross and he's dying. But right there, the earth splits. It splits because the true king came. When the true king came, he rode in on a colt like a king. They dressed him like a king. And he wore a crown, but not a normal king's crown, a crown of thorns. And then he conquered like a good king. But he conquered by dying and rising again to conquer death. And in that death, he bridged the gap between God and all who would believe. Which means that in Jesus, sins are really forgiven. If we believe, eternity is really guaranteed. It will go well for us under the reign of that king for all eternity. So in response, we can have joy. Joy without a seatbelt. Joy that doesn't disappoint in the end. Joy that doesn't leave us cynical and jaded. He's the true king so that we can celebrate to the point where the earth splits. So let's give ourselves to building and feeding that joy during this season. Anazor recommends a number of habits to feed our joy and to overcome apathy. One he says is just to confess apathy as sin to God and to one another. Sometimes we treat it like it's normal, like I'm just a cynical person. This is just how I am. But this isn't okay. This isn't okay if the true king reigns. Two, we need to do things that feed faith and hope. And I think we know how to do this. I mean, more Bible, more prayer, less Instagram, less Twitter. Feed the things that will increase our hope and our faith in Jesus. I'd like this to be an immediate, like, Matrix download where you get it and all of a sudden you're there. But this stuff doesn't happen without discipline. Disciplining our minds to dwell on what matters and what's true. Disciplining our hands to put down the phone. Disciplining our calendars to make time for what matters. So confess our apathy. Confess it as sin to God and to one another. Do the things that feed faith and hope and joy. Process the griefs and disappointment and doubt. Don't pretend like they didn't happen, but process them in terms of reality with God and with his people and under his word. Those things are real and they need to be dealt with so that they don't steal all our joy, so they don't make us cynical and jaded. He also recommends just talking about things that matter, talking about Jesus. Not just the trivial things, not just the small things. The small things are good and they're gifts from God, and it's not like we have to be nervous about mentioning them and avoiding those things. But we should discipline ourselves to talk about Jesus, to talk about what the biggest deal is, so that we can be in a mission to find that true joy that can only be found in him. So let's not, if he is this king, and he is, if he came to bring joy like that, and he did, and if the right way to celebrate the true king is with so much joy that the ground splits when you celebrate, and it is, then let's not settle for being meh and apathetic. Let's not be so cynical. Let's not respond to gospel truth with apathy. Let's believe.